Hi. I'm Laura Berkowitz. I'm co-president of the Brattleboro Area Jewish Community. So have you ever acted impulsively? Have you ever seen a situation that so warranted action, intervention, that you just stepped up without thinking or planning? Have you ever spoken up without knowing the facts? Well, I have. And when Deb Kitzmiller shared information about human trafficking with some of us in the Jewish community on Saturday, March 2nd, this was about when the news came out about the Robert Kraft arrest, which led to a New York Times article and a lengthy piece on NPR about the fact that individuals are being held against their will all over this country. Somebody's mother, somebody's daughter might be held in our neighborhood. It was so outrageous to think about. And a few days later, I was at town meeting in Marlboro, and our Vermont Representative Emily Long and Vermont Senator Rebecca Balint were there. And I stood up and asked them what they knew about this issue and what people like us, faith communities, might possibly do to stop it. And Becca shared that we had one of the most informed people on this topic right here in Vermont. So I contacted Linda Joy Sullivan. And in the process, I began to understand the complicated and slippery nature of both detection and prosecution of human trafficking. I also learned that I had to temper my impulses and slow down and get more information before I could act. Linda offered a training to a group from our synagogue, but I said that a lot more people would want this information. So through Kate Judd, our cantor and spiritual leader, I reached out to the Brattleboro Area Interfaith Leadership Alliance, which was eager to co-sponsor this event. Immediately, Reverend Audrey Walker, who's out there setting up food for us, offered to host here at the Brattleboro Congregational Church, and we're grateful to her for that. In addition to being a representative in the Vermont House from the Bennington-Rutland district, Linda Joy Sullivan is also the co-founder, board chair, and former executive director of a nonprofit organization that has served over 3,000 victims of human trafficking around the United States. She has created and delivered trainings for lawyers, judges, and schools. She has served as an expert witness on all aspects of human trafficking. The more research I do, the more I realize how much I don't know. I'm sure that some of you are more knowledgeable than I am, and if you are, bear with us, because I've asked Linda to do Human Trafficking 101 today. We are so grateful for your time, your expertise, and if folks need to leave for other commitments, that's fine. We're going to break in the middle and have some snacks. There's a bathroom in the corner of the room next door. So join me in welcoming Linda.
Thank you for that introduction. Far above my pay grade. Trust me. I'm humbled that you asked me to be here. I really am. And I'm grateful that you're all interested in being here. I apologize for my hoarse voice, but we have what's called the legislative kennel cough that we get when we're up there, and it's my turn. However, I do want to introduce you to Savannah, who is a student at Burton, who is also working on a human trafficking project. So I grabbed her and said, come on in. You're in charge of the tech. Okay. So anyway, I am going to begin at a basic level and let me walk through as much as we can. Hold your questions unless you really don't understand something. And we have experts in the back, which is fantastic, law enforcement. So I'm looking forward to their input at any time you all want to jump in. I don't get insulted if somebody disagrees. I don't get, feel free, okay? Because this is really important. Human trafficking does exist. And what I'd like to start with is to try to just identify some of the myths and realities, and then we'll go into some of the definitions and so on. So the agenda that I have is for us to be able to distinguish between the myths and reality of trafficking, and then to understand the distinction between sex and labor trafficking and smuggling, and see how they can actually overlap, as well as understanding the distinction of definitions when sex trafficking applies to youth, okay, and our younger generation. I also want to go over some factors that can put victims of human trafficking at risk, as well as those people who may feel they've identified issues in human trafficking, and I know you want to help, but we also have to watch out for your safety, and as we just heard from Laura, you have to know the facts, and we have people who you should go to and identify the issues and let them deal with it. Okay, there are ways, if you see something, to call a hotline, to work with the authorities, and to protect yourself, because you can very easily put a victim at further risk and force them further underground innocently, okay? So I applaud everybody who wants to help, but sometimes there are better ways to help, and it's really important to leave law enforcement to law enforcement. Okay, and I will say that over and over again. I'm not trying to discourage anybody, but safety of your lives as well as the victims, and being able to prosecute, if we can prosecute a trafficker, depends upon not interfering with law enforcement's case and the evidence, okay? So I'm going to bring that up a lot. And then I do want you to understand the paradigm, the human trafficking paradigm, and we'll go through that. And then we'll have some case studies, and you can see if I taught you well or if I didn't. Okay, so at any point, if you do have a question that you think I'm not going to get to, then and you really don't understand something, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, if you could kind of hold your questions, I will ask for them. So Savannah, you're on. You're in charge of hitting the slides. So we need to go to the next one, and we can start. So I think it's important for us to actually understand where human trafficking does occur. And I didn't want to be rude. If anybody has been involved or works professionally in this field, anyone here, let me know. So I can stay at the 101 level, and
I was a victim, so.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad you're here. And I'm glad you're healthy, and I'm glad you're able to give us some input. And we are going to talk also, okay, about being a victim and fact situations versus being an expert who can go into court and testify. So the distinction between being a fact witness on your own specific case and being an expert, okay? And that's important for law enforcement because they rely on the experts and the evidence. They need the fact witnesses to be able to bring the case and protect them and gather the evidence in order to have enough to bring the case. But then the experts are also important because they can convince a judge or a jury based upon the battle of the experts. Okay, and sometimes it's important to keep the victim away from the accuser. Okay, so we'll get into all of that. So let's start with the very first myth, okay? Human trafficking is always a violent crime, right? No, right, exactly, okay. So the bottom line is that it does involve kidnapping sometimes, but not all of the time. Okay, human trafficking can actually come right out of someone's home, okay? It can happen across the United States, it can happen in other countries, but it does happen here, but it's not always violent. It does involve psychological issues as well, and we're going to go into those elements, and we're going to go into how the whole grooming process by the trafficker does that, because the grooming process is the key to getting the victims embroiled into the actual trafficking arena. All human trafficking involves commercial sex, right? No, why not? Okay? Yes, there is commercial sex, there is labor. We have labor trafficking. Now, labor trafficking can, at one point in time, roll into a sex trafficking violation if the debt becomes so high that they need to pay they choose to pay off that debt and they choose to go into sex trafficking for that, that way to pay off a debt. But there is a distinction between labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And the other myth is that only undocumented foreign nationals get trafficked in the United States. No, okay? We have immigrants who are here with appropriate documentation that they can get trafficked, as well as people who are born here, okay, can get trafficked. So, human trafficking only happens in illegal or underground industries. No, it can happen anywhere. And we're going to go through the elements. We're going to go, I saw a face that looked a little shocked. Yeah, cleaning services, au pairs, and we're going to go into the different areas that it may be more predominant and why it's more predominant. Only women and girls can be victims and survivors of sex trafficking. No, okay, the male population is very prone to sex trafficking. And they may not come out as often because, and we'll get into that as well, but the populace, the marketing agenda on human trafficking has always been young girls and has always been females. But it's not fair because the males are just as vulnerable. And you will find as well when we go into some of the cases that judges will tend to be a bit more harsh on our younger female population with sentencing because they feel they have to protect them, so they'll put them into under their protection. And I've also taught trainings on human trafficking in female prisons and detention centers. And so I'm not going to be upset with my judges because I know where they're coming from and they're trying to help. And, girls can always, of course, get pregnant. And so that's another issue. So there are all different elements that we're going to cover, and hopefully you will understand why it's important to go to law enforcement or use the appropriate hotlines rather than reach out on your own. Okay. Human trafficking always involves moving, traveling, or transporting a person across national borders. No, it can actually happen right here. You don't have to, no transport is necessary for trafficking, and we'll get into smuggling and the distinction there. But it can happen right in your own home. All commercial sex is human trafficking. What do you think? Isn't that what it's all about? No, okay? Of course, commercial sex can involve human trafficking, but there are choices. Street workers decide that they want to get involved in commercial sex. Sometimes, as we'll get into when we distinguish between prostitution and street walking, okay, when it can become trafficking and where the paradigm fits in and where the elements have to happen pre the paradigm or post the paradigm. If the trafficked person actually consented, okay, to be trafficked on their first initial consultation, right? Or let's say situation, I'll say consultation, okay? Because they should have known better, that means that, in fact, they were no longer trafficked, correct? No. Every situation and every element is going to fall within the law, and every situation is going to have a fact situation, and the evidence will come out. The key is, if you're trafficked, we need to help them, we need to find them, we need to get them out, we need to get them to law enforcement, we need to get them to safe harbor. And there are a lot of players and a lot of players that we need to respect. And it's difficult sometimes to understand, how do you respect the different players? How do you respect the victim? How do you respect law enforcement? How do you respect the people who are accused of trafficking, who may not have been the ones who did the trafficking? So all of that falls into play, and I just want to get those elements out today, and I hope I'm successful at doing that. So, people being trafficked are physically unable to leave their situations because they're being held against their will. Now, this is a tricky one. What do you think? Okay, well, that's a good answer sometimes. So these are situations that are complicated. Many times people are physically restrained, but sometimes they're just psychologically groomed that they are restrained. Sometimes they go back and forth because of their survival needs. So we don't want to come up with just a basic stigma. We want to make sure we look at every case for what it's worth and see if the elements do rise to it. Human trafficking is a very difficult situation to prove in a court of law. So anytime we can get bills put through that give a tool to, law enforcement or legal defense for the victim, it's important that we do that. It may not be a major lift bill. If it's any tool whatsoever, if we can give law enforcement the right to do something that assists, we need to do that. Because the more tools they have, the better we will be able to combat this. So labor trafficking now, is only or primarily a problem in developing countries. No, right here in Vermont, we have an issue with that as well, and across the United States. So labor trafficking is definitely an issue that happens everywhere. The problem is that in the United States, labor trafficking has been reported less than sex trafficking, but that's changing. That dynamic is now changing, and we'll get into how labor trafficking can then morph into situations that create sex trafficking. And then, here we go. Traffickers target victims they don't know, right? Traffickers will never go after somebody they know, correct? No. They don't care who it is. Bottom line is, if it's going to be somebody they can groom, somebody that they can make money off of, because trafficking is a business. If they can make money, they're going for it. So be careful, because law enforcement is astute, and they know if they're going to return somebody, whether it be by court order or by their own assessment of a case to somebody, they will check out the spouses and the family members, including parents, before they return a victim to somebody where you would not know to do that, okay? So it's very important that we rely on our, people who are charged with helping our society and protecting our society, okay? So let's look at the definitions of human trafficking. So let's start with sex trafficking, okay? Sex trafficking, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, and that's the paradigm, and we're going to go into the elements of that, so you'll be able to distinguish between that. Or in which a person induced is to perform such an act and the person has not attained the age of 18 years old, okay? The recruitment, harboring, transportation provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. By the end of this, you're going to know that paradigm, okay? Okay, for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. That's human trafficking. Okay? Then we're going to go into the different areas of human trafficking. So there is a Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which goes into the distinction. The family service divisions of both Vermont and other states have elements that they use to take it a little bit further. They still follow the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, okay, the law, but they also look at, was the minor exploited so that they can jump on in? Was there transporting? Was there harboring? Was there sexual exploitation? They have to look at these. So our social services people and say DCF as well, have to look at all of this. They look at the actual survival sex. Survival sex for a young person is very important. We may see somebody, say from a foster care, who wants a pair of sneakers. And there may be a gang that's already started and infiltrated a school, and they go after a young, vulnerable child who really wants to be part of the group. And the sneakers are important. So that can turn into a sex trafficking act because there's a benefit, and we're going to see what the issues are when we go into the actual paradigm. You have to watch using a minor child in pornography, and it happens more often than you think. There were a lot of issues with Backpage, the magazine out of New York, and the advertisements there, and there are code words that are up on various newspapers and online. So once again, in schools, you may see people taking pictures, and those pictures can be transformed and turned over to other Johns, or usually the trafficker and the hierarchy that will go through the grooming process. If you do find out that there is a phone being used that may lead to trafficking, don't take the phone. Contact law enforcement. Don't contaminate the evidence, okay? You're not the person who's supposed to be doing the enforcement. But don't keep it a secret. Get hold of the right authorities and get out there. So exploiting a minor by having him perform in sexual venues, carnivals, peep shows, things like that, are also things that Human Services, DCF, and any kind of family service division will look at. People who work in the human trafficking fields will look at that on a case-by-case basis, but our family service division is charged with really looking at what goes on when somebody goes into that division. So what we're doing as well, which is very important, is trying to change the language that is being used so that people understand that human trafficking victims are truly victims. And so what inappropriate language has been out there for a long time is that the blame is on the child rather than the perpetrator. If a child comes home and say a parent actually found out that a child was involved in something that they were uncomfortable with, tendency might be to say, it's your fault. We want that whole language, that whole mentality to be changed, so when people start to understand that human trafficking really does exist, that they understand who not to blame. The bad kid, we want that to go away. Associating trafficking with delinquency for minors, that's not always the case. Okay, honor students get trafficked. Law students get trafficked, okay? People get trafficked. It can happen anywhere. So we don't want it to be a label that has a long-lasting stigma. We want you to understand what really happens. So there's more of an appropriate way to look at that. So Savannah, if you flip the... Okay. We want people to understand that the child is actually not legally responsible, socially able sometimes to make a decision, is not developmentally ready to make a decision. So that's what we need to understand. What happens with the child? And then what happens with that child who becomes an adult? And when it crosses over between 17 and 18, is it trafficking? Is it choice? And each case is different. And the timing of the paradigm will control that often, okay? So whether the consent happened prior to the paradigm or post the paradigm, or even changes as it morphs through the case. So it's very important that we define what happened to the child rather than labeling the victim, because we believe that a young person truly deserves services and truly deserves support. And unless we get human trafficking awareness out there, people will not be open to saying we need to help and we need more resources. So we need to acknowledge the victim, and we need to understand that there is a perpetrator and there is an offender, okay? Okay, so let's start. Where does the scouting happen, okay? I'm the scout. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to find myself some victims, except I don't think they're victims, okay? And we're going to find them. Campus recruitment. I'll go right on campus. I'll put together a lower tier of wise guys or organized groups to start the recruitment process. Social media recruitment. I can advertise right on Backpage because we actually go online, right, with personal ads, right? There are codes in some of those personal ads that you can identify, and we're going to get into some of the lingo that's actually used, so you'll be familiar with some of those words. There are gangs, of course. Kidnapping or sale by a family. I worked on a case where somebody was actually sold for a mortgage payment. Is that the shocking? Good. If you would have said no, it would have made me a little nervous. Okay. So we're going to look at the tools of the trade, and I think you'll appreciate what I'm trying to build up to, which is the grooming process, is the seduction. We have mail order brides. Now that's a fine line, because in some cultures, that's okay. However, we need to distinguish if it's a mail order bride and if it's legally okay in the United States, what's really going on. Arranged marriages, sometimes is that trafficking, is it not? There was a case that I worked on with a young woman from Israel, actually, and she was a mail order bride to somebody in Washington, D.C., and came over, and she was trafficked. And it took 4 years for her to get out. She went back to Israel, and she finally did come back to the United States, and she's a lawyer now, and guess what she does? She represents victims of human trafficking. But the au pairs and any other business opportunity is an open venue, so we can just find them anywhere. So where does it actually occur, okay? Street trafficking, which is not always prostitution, okay? And prostitution is not always street trafficking. Truck stops. And I have to tell you, I love the truckers, okay? The truckers are awesome. They watch out for victims of human trafficking. They go out of their way to unite, to help. They have contacted an organization like the organization I've co-founded all the time. And they will be right there bringing victims to safety, letting law enforcement know where these victims are. They are amazing, and they have organized across the United States, and they are fantastic. And I'm sure there's always the flip side. I'm sure there's always that isolated and not so wonderful, but the truckers, yes. Okay, we have brothels, okay? And we also have trafficking within families and their homes, like the example I just gave you. Group homes and shelters. We send our victims there, knowingly or not knowingly, and it can happen right there. And it can happen from shelter to shelter. And that's why it's important that law enforcement's involved, that we work with the people we're supposed to, the authorities who are told, so they can go in. Because you never want to accuse or falsely accuse a business or shelter if in fact you just think it's going on. And sometimes a victim may say it's going on, but you're not the person who they should be telling the story to. They need to go to appropriate authorities so that the story could be vetted. Okay, very important. Phone sex lines, webcams. Strip clubs, but not all strip clubs are, areas, but these are just places that it can happen. Hotels or motels. What I have found is important, and we're going to some of the red flags for hotels and motels. If there were appropriate training in the hotels and motels, some of the red flags are, hey, can I have a room that's near the exit? And I always come here on Fridays, and I'm always paying cash, but I always want that room, where there's an exit. Doesn't mean that the person is actually going to be trafficking somebody, but pay attention. If the person keeps coming in with a young male or female or an older male or female, that looks a little strained or, restrained, just pay attention. So training within the businesses, and we'll get into that as well, is very important. Massage parlors, we all heard about those, okay? Doesn't mean that all massage parlors are trafficking locations, okay? Massage parlors are good, okay? And online. So, of course, online is something that's very difficult to track. And relationships start with Match.com and all sorts of organizations like that. But they also can, bring out some trafficking victims and online relationships. So it's important for us to watch our younger generation and try to keep them more supervised and not just let their computers be their toys to go forward. While computers and online, of course, gives us great worldwide knowledge, we have to be very careful. So why does it happen, right? We should be saying, okay, in this day and age, why is this happening? What is wrong with us? So there are a bunch of push factors, and a lot is poverty and economic difficulty. But just because you're in poverty doesn't mean that you're going to be trafficked. It doesn't go hand in hand. There's a lack of opportunity in jobs, and sometimes trafficking victims may go out and they need lifestyle changes. So you may have a mom who makes an outright decision to go out and prostitute to feed her children. Well, that's not trafficking. However, it may turn into a trafficking situation later on if certain elements rise to that. Lack of education or literacy. Remember, these are just pushes. These are areas that can make it happen. Why would I leave? Intimate partner violence, that's a big one. All of a sudden, you're thrown out in the street, you've been abused, you're already an emotional victim, okay? You're very low self-esteem. You are a prime target to be trafficked. Subordinate identity. I'm not as good as you are, okay? Low self-esteem, discrimination, and then, of course, ethnic violence, war, and civil violence. But what about the pull factors? I want a better life. That was the mom situation I told you about. You want safety or protection. What if you are in a situation where there is violence going on and a trafficker comes over and offers you this protection? You will go, and we'll see when we go through the grooming relationship situation. You also want stability. I want control of my life. Does that mean that everybody who wants control of their life is going to become a victim of human trafficking? No. But sometimes the depressing state that you go into can show you why you may be vulnerable to become a victim of human trafficking. And then, of course, you've been offered false opportunities, but the search for money, drugs, and validation or belonging. There is a definite correlation between victims of human trafficking and drugs in a different manner, okay? Because sometimes drugs can become part of the crimes that you're forced to do within the trafficking victim or take to get through the sexual acts. And that's an entirely different presentation, okay? And financial desires. So who actually is at risk to being groomed? And I'm going to use that word groomed a lot, and we'll go through what grooming is. Kids, teens, runaways, college students who need money. If I am a college student and I'm having my life opened up to exploring my sexual desires, well, why not get some money and pay my bills? But is that trafficking? Not if that's the only way it's going down. However, it can turn into something, or how will you lured into it, and who is getting the benefit of the money. Our latchkey kids. We have kids who are home because we have parents who are working 2 jobs. So we have an older sibling who may be 10, who's watching the 6-year-old, okay? They're at home. They're vulnerable. are foster care children. And we went through a sneaker example before, but we'll go into far more. Okay? So once again, we have homeless children, youth on the run. We have males and females, every race, every socioeconomic class in any area is where you will find a victim of human trafficking. Refugees, unaccompanied minors, children and youth in foster care, and our LGBTQ youth. Particularly our LGBTQ youth are vulnerable, but now they become more aware that they are vulnerable, so more resources are going to assist them. So once again, we know that any child can be at risk, any adult can be at risk, but usually with a greater social, economic, and environmental vulnerability is where they're going to be found, or where we'll find more of the push. So let's look at some of the characteristics of our children at risk at recruitment. And we're not going to stay just on children, because we are going to go into adults as well. But the unsupervised internet that we just spoke about, that is a big deal. Pay attention to that, because once you have obsessive use of that, you're going to hit social media and it goes all over. We can't control our own information that we put up on social media. So how is a child going to do that? Okay? And of course, for me, I say child, that's anybody under 99. Okay, so you have to be careful with that. And if you're attracted to consumer goods, you want money. You want to purchase. You're online, you're going to purchase. And if you notice when you're online and you purchase, all of a sudden you start getting emails about what you purchased, and are you interested in this? And are you interested in this? And you go, how did I know that? It's very scary. Plus, everybody has a desire to develop some sort of romantic relationship. And when you do, and you go out to find partner right, are you really going to say, wait, I remember having this trafficking presentation, let me look at the paradigm? No, you're going to go out and you're going to have a blast. So romantic relationships are like a big tool for recruitment. You'll notice frequent fighting with parents or caregivers. Those are your kids who want to go out and run away. It doesn't necessarily mean that every child is, so please always keep that in mind, but it happens. And we as parents, whoever parents or caregivers, what happens when your kid has a hissy fit and runs out and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I can't call, I can't follow up, they're going to get upset, but I better call, I better follow up. Okay? And so what happens? But they're out there for that minute to how many hours on their own. So it's out of our control. And once you let a young child go out when it's out of their control, it's out of their control as well. So watch for withdrawal or lack of interest in hobbies or activities. Sometimes we overwhelm our youth with forcing them to do too much, and then they burn out, and then they get exhausted, and they want to fit into their own peers, with their own peers and their own groups. They want to be part of something. That's what we are. We're social animals. We need to be part of a group. So that will be a trigger for somebody to look to groom somebody. And our homeless youth, of course, are youth on the run. They're surviving on the streets. And that is just an entirely different ability to even understand. Do you imagine yourself right now being homeless with everything you know about how to survive? It's scary, right? What about a child? What would be the first person you'd run to? The first person who said, come on, let me take you over here and get you a hamburger. Exactly right. That's exactly right. So let's look at actually what some of the influences, and this is like a recap of the risk of sex trafficking, society. And I will tell you this, from all of the victims that I have worked with in human trafficking, no matter how long the case took or how short the case was, when they're first brought in to work with you or picked up and brought to safety, They blame society. They blame us. Because it's our job to protect them. And we failed. And that's the attitude that they will have. And don't blame them for that attitude, okay? Because we told them parents will take care of them, schools will take care of them, law enforcement will take care of them. And you will see some of the heavy guerrilla grooming that is done when we go through this, where they will actually lead these victims to believe that law enforcement are the real bad guys, okay? So we need to understand that they believe that society is the problem. We failed them. And if you ever do work with a victim of human trafficking, I implore of you, please do not make a promise to them that you can't keep. They rely on trust. Their trust in everybody in society has been broken. Do not make a promise that you can't keep. And we will get into that when we talk about you all as first responders and how you just might be making promises you can't keep. Okay? So let's keep that up here as well. So our community, relationships, and us as an individual, our own self-esteem, etc., is going to decide, are we going to be more vulnerable or less vulnerable? But it's nobody's fault. If somebody becomes a victim of human trafficking, remember the inappropriate thought process versus the new way of thinking, okay? Okay, here we go, trafficking paradigm. Let's start. Force, fraud, or coercion. Force, beating, slapping, beating with objects, belts. Does that sound like it's force? But what about like parents who raise their kids that way? Does that mean they're trafficked? No. Okay. Burning, sexual assault, rape, gang rape, confinement, being locked in, torture practices, and then we're going to go into the seasoning and the initiation. But this is what would qualify as the force element in the paradigm. Okay? When we go to the coercion, you'll see a bit of a slant on this. But pay attention here when we talk about force, because this will be the area when we talk about the guerrilla pimps and the circle, the pimp circle, where they use this to happen. Okay, so let's look at fraud. Making false promises. I promise that if you come with me, I will give you a home. I will give you a wonderful life. You will make a lot of money. I will love you forever. Deceitful, enticing, and affectionate behavior. Flaunting the young partner or the new partner. Meet my friends. This person is wonderful. Until we get into the grooming process. Withholding wages. I made a promise to you that you're going to come and you're going to work, and I'm not going to give you your money. That's the fraud part. That's not the force part, okay? Lying about working conditions, about the promise of a better life. So this particular area, the fraud, preying on someone's desperation, and blackmail and extortion. Blackmail and extortion, very easily to use, okay? First of all, I know something about you, okay? However, the fraud part is very difficult to prove in a court of law. So that's why it's not force, fraud, and coercion, okay? It's force, fraud, or coercion, okay? Coercion. Threats of serious harm or restraint. Notice it's threats. In a group of victims of human trafficking who've already been indoctrinated, I might have, say, Savannah, I know Savannah's been trafficked and I've been trafficked into the same group. They may remove me, and Savannah thinks, where is she being taken? And they may go over to Savannah and say, if you don't do A, B, or C, Linda Joy's not coming back. Now it's up to Savannah to make a decision. Okay? So these are threats, harm, the whole psychological aspect that's starting. Intimidation and humiliation in the pimp circle. Pimps will circle around the victim. They will beat them, urinate on them, really do all sorts of humiliating, harmful things to the victim to indoctrinate them and really make them understand that they are trafficked and they are part of this trafficking family now. And that is part of the coercion, working with the mind as well as the physical. Abusive behavior, setting this whole climate of fear, this whole dependency. You have to love me, you depend on me, you won't eat, you won't go out, you want freedoms, you want to be able to go use a phone, you want to be able to go across the street on your own. This is all part of the coercion. And then establishing quotas, because I'm going to tell you what you need to earn. And if you don't earn that, you're not going to get all of those wonderful benefits like being able to walk across the street by yourself, okay? So, human smuggling. This is a very important distinction between human trafficking. Human smuggling is actually the importation of people into the U.S., which involves a deliberate evasion of the laws, of the immigration laws, okay? Illegal aliens coming into the U.S., but they know they are participating in this because they want to come over. Very important that you understand that smuggling is transportation-based and it's not interchangeable with trafficking. Trafficking is exploitation-based, okay? It does not mean that you can't be smuggled and then eventually be trafficked. However, if I want to come over to the United States and I know the only way for me to do that is to breach the immigration laws and I make that decision, that's not trafficking, okay? That's smuggling, and I'm coming over knowing there may be consequences. It's a choice. And as I said, it can turn into trafficking. Not all smuggling does, but it can. But one is exploitation-based, that's trafficking, and smuggling is transportation-based. So, when we look at trafficking, it must contain an element of force, fraud, or coercion. And that element can be an actual one, a perceived one, or an implied one. However, to build a case and take it to court and actually bring a trafficker to justice is not an easy feat, okay? So oftentimes, there may be pleas or settlements for a lower charge. Don't get angry over that, because if you can get a lower charge and you can get a victim to safety and you can get a trafficker on the radar, it's better than just throwing everybody back out to the street. So the key here is that trafficking can be forced labor and exploitation, but it can't be smuggling, right? You can be enslaved with limited movement or isolation, and you can even have your documents confiscated. Oftentimes, you'll be given other documents that the trafficker needs you to use, which will have a different age, okay, change in photo. You also may know that your documents that have been confiscated, part of the coercion process and part of the grooming process is to know that the trafficker is going to tell you that they're going to give your documents to somebody else who's going to commit a crime under your name, so you are now wanted. That is a very common element. Happens a lot in Florida. Okay, so I've been in a lot of cases in Florida where that has been used. But that is a very common grooming process. Sometimes they don't even use the documents, but they tell you. So now we're getting into what? The coercion, the psychological. So there's no requirement to cross an international border to be trafficked. The person, however, must be actually involved in the labor or the service or the commercial act for them to be considered trafficked, okay? For it to actually meet that paradigm. Okay. Smuggling, entirely different. The person who's smuggling usually cooperates. There's no implied coercion here, okay? They pretty much know this is what we want to do. They are complicit in the crime. They come across an international border, okay? And all they have to do is be in the country, okay? Attempt to illegally enter. That is the arrival where the smuggling ends. That's the point where trafficking may begin, but does not mean that everybody who's been smuggled in to a country is going to be trafficked. Very important, we know that distinction. Okay, what kind of sex trafficking do we have out there? How can prostitution be trafficking? I want to be a prostitute, I want to be a prostitute, right?
Well, for your forced coercion or fraud.
Yeah, right. So there we go. Yeah. Okay, I could go home now. Okay, brothels, online, truck stops. Remember, I love the truckers. Okay, businesses, farms, domestic work, begging, peddling. Begging and peddling is a big vulnerable spot. Okay, stripping. These are areas where it's very easy, more easy to go in if you're a trafficker or you're the person who's sent out by the trafficker to begin to get the victims to groom. So, child sex trafficking, we have our pimps and our traffickers, and we're going into that. But it can be family-based, could also be gang-controlled. There can also be non-pimp or traffic-controlled survival sex. I'm hungry. I really would like to sleep under that, in that barn. Peers to peer, peer to peer. You do it, you want to be part of my group. I'm going to get you money for your sneakers. And then your own independent renegading. I'm out there, I'm going to be, wild, I'm going to, explore life, and now I'm hungry. And now I have no place to stay, and I can't go home. Labor trafficking we'll find in farming, domestic work, housekeeping, the nanny, the au pair, massage parlors, nail salons, mail-order bras, restaurants, and many other. There are about 25 different areas that we have a list of businesses, and we'll go over that as well. So let's just take an easy case. Here's Rachel. You tell me if she's trafficked or smuggled. Rachel was invited to come to the United States by family friends. They told her she could work for them as a housekeeper, and they would pay her $100 per week. Rachel was provided with fraudulent documents and departed for the U.S. with her new employer. She knew that this was illegal, but she needed the money and was willing to take the risk. Was she trafficked or smuggled?
Smuggled.
Okay. Upon arriving in the United States, Rachel was kept in isolation. She was given a place to sleep in the basement and told not to speak to anyone, or she would be turned over to the Immigration Service. Rachel was never paid for her work and felt that she had no one to turn to for help. Was Rachel smuggled or trafficked?
Now trafficked.
Okay, so these are the types of cases that elements change. Law enforcement can figure this out, not us. We see it, we smell it, we tell them. We call the authorities, okay? Very important, because a case like this, see how it shifts, and this is a very simple case. See how it shifts? We don't want to be responsible for ruining Rachel's chances of getting removed and having a fair trial if one's necessary, okay, by ruining the evidence. Nope, my fault. I was trying to get to, here we go, okay. Does anybody need to ask me anything, or could we keep going? Okay. The indoctrination and the grooming seasoning process, and this is key to trafficking. This is where this is where the traffickers actually break down that victim. They take the healthy, adolescent sexual boundaries, and they turn it into commercial sex with strangers. It is a systematic process. It is powerful. It has been documented, and it's been replicated by pimps nationwide. In fact, pimps are famous for publishing their own manuals, and we'll get to some excerpts from some of them as well. If you gotta sell it, right? The goal here is to achieve complete control over someone's identity, their entire individuality, and get hold of their own will. And we're going to do this by physical, by mental and emotional controls, and all those three things that the pimps and traffickers are using are going to fall into the paradigm, so when we have to go and charge them, if we can, we're going to hope that we have enough evidence in those areas to meet the paradigm to be able to bring them to court. That's your trafficking paradigm: force, fraud, or coercion. Gangs. Sex trafficking is often tied to the gang culture. Think it should be? Heck yeah, okay? Because gangs in schools, gangs out in the street, okay, definitely, they infiltrate, they work, they know other areas of, whether it be organized or non-organized crime. They want female members to go out and have sex for money. And every time I say female here, I also mean the male population, okay? So they want you to join the gang. They want you to maintain status in the gang. They want you to support that gang monetarily, because what is the gang going to give them? They're the family, okay? They become the power. You can't move up on your own. Were a horrible person. Nobody wanted you. But with us, you're in, because you're going to take that oath and you're going to be part of us. And we're also going to have whatever you do over your head so that you can't leave or report about us. So
They're support system.
that's exactly right. They're a strong support system.
Oftentimes they're the only support system there.
That's the only support system until they move you to, right, and we're going to get to that. So porn and social norms. The adult sex industry actually has become normalized in our culture. Some people like that, some people don't. We're not here to decide that, okay? What we're here to talk about is that even though it's normalized in our culture, it now opens up a new arena for trafficking. Strip clubs are very common, provocative advertising, submissive stereotype, dating sites. Here's what it is. We're here in the United States. It's a free country, business opportunities. Just be aware that there are effects and that there are ramifications. Doesn't mean we should eliminate all this or not eliminate all this, okay? But that's not our job. We're just supposed to be aware, okay? Drugs. There's definitely a connection between opiate, heroin, and human trafficking. And here are statistics, and I have, which I'm not going to do today, a training on the correlation between drugs and human trafficking, and I would be more than happy just to share that with anybody, and you don't have to have me come back and talk about it. You could read that one. It's pretty self-explanatory. But there has been an increase, and I've actually shared that particular PowerPoint with the governors and judges. But we have had twice as many federal indictments against heroin dealers over the past 2 years since 2013, and it's been doubling of the number of deaths in Vermont from heroin overdoses, we all know, has doubled. So that's a situation. But remember, if you're a young child or an adult, a female or a male adult, and you are trafficked, and you know you're trafficked, and you have to go out and meet that quota, sometimes it's going to be a lot easier to be on one of these drugs to get through your workload. Okay? And that is something what? That could be held over your head, while you will not go and escape, while you will not go tell law enforcement, because you've committed a crime. Okay? So let's get into our pimps. And believe me, it is not easy. These guys have it tough. We're going to look at the psychology of the pimp control. We're going to look at the pimp psychological methodology. We're going to look at how they increase fear. Because the pimp is powerful. Remember that the pimp is powerful. And as powerful as the pimp is, what happens to the victim? Wrong hand movement. They become grateful. Grateful to that pimp who has become their source, their family source, right? Who's become their protector, who has been the person who's going to be giving them gifts. And all of a sudden, jewelry may turn into a glass of water, okay? Or the drugs they need to get through. The pimp becomes their savior. The pimp has rewards. All of these rewards, of course, are illusionary, but illusionary to maybe us. Not so illusionary to the victim who's going through that process, who left a lifestyle that wasn't so great to begin with. Of course, there were those who've been forced who were in great lifestyles, but now it's illusionary. What is the key here? The key factor is that the pimp profits. It's a business, and that pimp must make money. So let's go inside the mind of a trafficker, and this actually came out of one of the pimp's books. It's called an instructional manual, and there are about 4 or 5 of them now. This is what they do. This is actually their guideline. You'll start to dress her. You'll think for her. You'll own her. If you and your victim are sexually active, slow it down. After sex, take her shopping for one item. Hair, nails is fine. She'll develop a feeling of accomplishment. The shopping after a month will be replaced with cash. The lovemaking will turn into raw sex. She'll start to crave intimacy. So notice what's happening. They're removing the intimacy from the process. She will crave that intimacy and be willing to do anything to get back into your good graces. After you have broken her spirit, she'll have no sense of self-value. Now, pimp, put on a price tag on the item that you have just manufactured. And there will be logs of how much each victim is worth and how they can move up or down. There are cases where victims become pregnant. What's happened to the value on that one? What becomes valuable? We're going into a byproduct of human trafficking. We're going into the black baby market. What happens to an older victim who may have been addicted that the pimp actually keeps putting back in to and paying for hospitalization, and eventually the costs get too high? What becomes a byproduct of that person? Their organs. Okay? So we've seen byproducts turn into black market organs sales. Okay? So human trafficking is not so cut and dry. Okay. So let's look at the process of trafficking control. It starts with recruitment, right? You need to get the victim. So we've got youth that need love and affection. We have adults that need love and affection. And remember, it can occur online, through social networking, and right out of anyone's home or schools, okay? And it can occur directly with the pimp itself. It can occur with a bottom girl, and we're going to go through that, or other victims. If I'm a victim, I might be sent out to recruit Laura. And I might not want to go back without Laura because I know it's going to happen to me. Okay? Grooming. That is the time that we just went through, where they're going to do the time, the gifts, get the affection going, have them create the isolation, have them break down that person's identity. That is where the increase of manipulation happens. We will actually test the person's sexual boundaries at this point in time and remove what? The affection. Turn it into raw sex so that the victim wants you back. Then we turn them out. That's where there's a full shift in the relationship and you are sent out to actually be exploited in commercial sexualization. It can be gradual. It can start out where the trafficker promises certain exploitation will only happen with one date, then 2 dates, then, oh my goodness, we went out to dinner and I got this great hotel room and I bought all this champagne and I can't believe we have to pay for this bill and I did this for you and you caused me to create so much debt and I did it for you, so so-and-so's down the hall. You need to take care of them. Okay? Let's look at step 1 where they actually develop the relationship. It's usually with an older man or a woman, and the victim actually regards this person as his or her boyfriend or girlfriend. There is an actual assessment of the victim's needs. So this isn't done blindly. Okay? People, the pimps and traffickers assess what does that victim need, and they supply it. Okay? Whether it's flattery, whether it's money, whether it's a home, clothes, these are the promises. These are the displays of the acts of love. That victim is actually enticed to begin the sexual relationship with their new friend. The victim is then encouraged to stay away longer from home because remember, you can still go home and be trafficked. You can still go home during the grooming process. Oftentimes the victim thinks it's just a romantic, relationship starting. They're not aware that they are being groomed to be trafficked. Finally, the victim is encouraged not to go home at all. Next what will happen is they'll do that short trip. They'll go away with the boyfriend or girlfriend. And that's where I was just explaining, like they may get the hotel room and they may build up the debt. They're convinced to actually prostitute themselves to fulfill financial needs, to enhance their relationship. The boyfriend-girlfriend, they begin the process of the exploitation and they introduce these victims to other groups of men or women. And remember, okay, pimps, traffickers, it's not only for men, it can be women as well. They will ask the victim to provide sexual favors to men because they are his friends. If that victim refuses, that's where the threats begin. That's where the potential abuse is threatened and actually may happen. And they will start the coercive measures. So that's where you're going to have the force, and that's where you're going to have the coercion. The fraud's already happened, right, through this grooming process. So the objective is to give the boyfriend-girlfriend, the trafficker's person, dominance and control over the victim. Now we have to get the victim to be compliant and to be fearful. We may have a victim that is an unknown part of the town or the country. That's scary enough, right? And you're under control of somebody who you thought loved you. They realize that their family and friends don't actually know where they are. And how would they even reach out to them because of all of the promises that have been made to them now about what will happen? So the element of control that's exercised by the boyfriend-girlfriend and other men and women reinforces this victim's vulnerability. This victim's will is now broken, and they become psychologically dependent upon the Stockholm Syndrome. That's called capture bonding, traumatic bonding. I don't know if you ever heard of the Stockholm Syndrome. It's like what everybody talks about when the victim falls in love with their pimp, okay? Well, just so you know, and we will talk about that later, there's also the flip side of that, where the pimp or the trafficker falls in love with their victim, and that's called Lima Syndrome. So now it's time for you to learn the house rules. Control methods, okay, force, fraud, coercion. The control methods are used to teach the house rules. How are you supposed to interact, Mr. or Miss Victim, with traffickers, authorities, the Johns, and other customers along the way to meet your nightly quotas? If you violate these rules, violence is reinforced. Extreme physical and sexual violence. You are required to commit other criminal acts, and you will be required to recruit other potential victims. And this is how it builds. If a victim is underage, the trafficker will usually provide a false name and date of birth to provide to the authorities if encountered. Okay? And they have been taught the rules of the house so they know what to say, what not to say. Oftentimes, a victim may go into court and be willing to testify, and a trafficker or a pimp may show up who is the defendant, and an astute judge, and I've trained many judges, I hope, asks the pimp or the trafficker, who's your lawyer? Who's paying for your lawyer? Then you can trace the lawyers that represent the victims and the traffickers. Because oftentimes, a victim will be sent an attorney by their pimp or their trafficker. Here we have some of the trafficking lingo. And before you even look, okay, do not use this lingo if you encounter a victim of human trafficking. It is not good to think that you are cool with them or in with them, okay? You're not part of what they are going through. It's not going to get them to speak to you. Trust me, they are far smarter than we are, okay? So, the bottom or the bottom bitch, a person who is actually appointed by the pimp trafficker to recruit potential victims. They are the ones who report the violation of the rules, and they are recruited to help with the punishment. Branded, a tattoo on the victim that actually indicates ownership by the pimp. There was a case in Florida that came through our organization where a young girl, 12 years old, had the pimp's tattoo on her eyelids. And there are organizations and people, good people out there. There are tattoo parlors. Now, not all tattoo parlors are bad, okay? Tattoo parlors who work with organizations to remove the tattoos, okay? So we also want to watch stigmas. We want to watch labeling, okay? We can bring victims that we got who have tattoos, and they help remove them. Daddy, okay? A term a male trafficker, a pimp requires his victims to call him. Post-traumatic disorder, okay? There was a case that I was working with where a woman had 2 children now, married. She came out as a victim. She was remarried. She had 2 beautiful children. Every time she went home and her new husband went to her children and said, "Come to daddy," she would lose it. Re-triggering. When you go into a courtroom or you go to law enforcement, we hope that the question to a child isn't, when's the last time you saw your daddy? Because innocently, you can use the wrong buzzword. What does that mean? There was a case for a very young child who was under 4 years old who was brought to law enforcement, and the question was, when's the last time you were fed? Well, feeding time was the sexual act. So you have to be aware of how subliminal these terms are, okay? So please, to try to speak to a victim, don't think this will get you closer to the victim. This is for your knowledge and your understanding, okay? So if we go to the family or folks, that's all of the victims that are underneath the actual trafficker or the pimp. That's where they've created their own family environment. The lot lizard, That's your derogatory term for prostituted women and children at the truck stops. Okay? Your pimp circle, and this is what we talked about before. This is actually where the pimp circles around a victim to intimidate them and discipline them. They use verbal, they use physical threats, and they actually do beat them. They beat them with coat wires, they urinate on them, they do everything that they need to do to make sure that that victim understands that this is serious, this is real, and they are now under the control of the actual new family. And then, of course, the quota. That's the amount of money that the victim actually has to go out and earn and bring back to the trafficker or the pimp. And if that quota is not met, that victim may be beaten and moved on to another stable. Okay? Stable. Okay, so that's your group of victims that are under the control of the pimp. And you can be traded up or traded down within that stable. Once you're turned out, that means you're forced into the prostitution. You're newly turned out. Wifey or wife-in-law, that's the term prostituted women and children are required to call the other females in the stable. Seasoning is that grooming process. Seasoning is the process we spoke about before, where they break you down psychologically and they indoctrinate you. Part of that grooming process, and that is vital to what goes on in human trafficking. Then we have the kiddie track or the runaway track, which is self-explanatory. And then we have that guerrilla pimp. That's that violent trafficker or the pimp who comes into that circle, who really does the beating, who really does the defecating, who really does the most harm to make sure that you understand that you are part of that family and you are not going anywhere. Dates, Johns, and tricks, that's the buyers of the commercial sex. Square is a term used to describe trying to go straight and get out of the life. It also describes law enforcement and those that just don't understand the game. Okay? Stroll or track, that's the common area or the cross streets where street prostitution is known to occur on a nightly basis. And there is a lot more going on here. But let's just recap right now. We have our paradigm. We have force, coercion, and fraud. Force, physical assault, sexual assault, physical confinement, withholding medical care. Coercion, psychological manipulation, verbal or emotional abuse, debt bondage, systems of reward or punishment, withholding legal documents, very scary, very important, threats of harm or arrest, and fraud. That's your fraudulent employment offers, your false promises, which we will never make, and withholding wages. So, would you like to take a few second break, or are you good? You're the boss. Good? Okay. So, sometimes boyfriends and girlfriends are actually pimps in disguise. You tell me what's going on here. It's a nice case. Jenna was beautiful, and she dreamed of being a dancer. Her boyfriend brought up the idea of becoming an exotic dancer to get her career going. He even took her to the interview. Jenna viewed this as a sort of a bodyguard in case she didn't like the place. Jenna was psyched that her boyfriend was supportive of her dancing career and that he brilliantly figured out a way for her to earn money so she could go on real theater auditions until she got the part. When Jenna began to get uncomfortable at the club, her boyfriend said, "If you work the club for a couple more years, we can have so much money." And all of these cases, by the way, are real cases. So Jenna was concerned about disappointing him and continued to strip. Her boyfriend encouraged Jenna to work longer hours and more days. Jenna dropped out of school, and her boyfriend told her not to worry because he would finish college and then she could just go on dance auditions. Jenna feared he would get angry if she didn't have good days, where she did well and with bringing in the money. So before you go there, was she trafficked?
Being gross.
Was she trafficked?
No.
Seems like it. Well, at least being groomed to be
If she was
trafficked.
dancing only, I don't consider that trafficking, but if she was,
She's being coerced to do it though, so she's being trafficked.
But she was in a relationship with them.
act. Dancing is not a sexual act. She's not being forced to have sex with strangers. She's dancing for them. So it's, to me, that's a little bit different.
She made her own decision to continue, whether we as women think it was a good decision or whether men think it was a good decision. However, does it mean it couldn't lead up to it? Possibly. Just the fact that most of the people who hear that case think it's because, well, you know, he went to college. Well, it doesn't say, one, that she paid for his college. It doesn't say, two, that she didn't want to pay for his college. And it doesn't say that he beat her or harmed her to pay for his college. Okay, so we don't know any of that. So the key here right now is don't jump to conclusions on cases. Get those cases to law enforcement. If there's any kind of charge or anything, they'll figure it out, okay? So what we have here is a cycle of violence that actually happens, and I'm just going to skim right through this because this is just existent there. And we have the tension building, and that's where the batterer actually gets more angry, and it builds up. And then we go into the crisis phase. And that's where your batterer becomes unpredictable. And this ties also into the whole trafficking paradigm and the grooming process. Then we get that makeup period, okay, where the batterer becomes loving and they're apologetic and they're reaccepted, and that's part of the grooming process. And then we get the calm phase, where the batterer acts like the abuse didn't happen, okay? And this cycle can take hours and days, and it goes on and on and on. And this is part of the actual grooming process, the underlying elements that the pimps and traffickers use. So I just want you to be aware that this exists. So then you say, what happens? The fight or flight response. It's physiological response. It's triggered when we have a strong emotion like fear. So what do? You're going to be trafficked. If you realize you're going to be trafficked, do you fight or do you flight? Do you run? Everybody's different, right? But why don't you leave? Once you are a victim, why don't you just leave and get help? Because the power of the traffickers' control methods are exactly that. Powerful, very strong. You may be in captivity, you may be in confinement. You often may be accompanied by a guard. They use threats of violence. They actually use violence. They enforce fear. You become psychologically their puppet, their victim, okay? And they take it out with threats also on your loved ones. Because believe me, they do find out who is in your other family, and they will hold that over the victims' heads. You become so dependent that you can't leave, or you can't ask for help. You become very much afraid. You develop shame. You develop self-blame. You are so dependent. And then, of course, there's that debt bondage. You owe money. You have a loyalty to your pimp. You're not familiar with your surroundings. There may be social barriers. You may not be able to go out or do anything. You may not have documentation or ID. So there are a lot of reasons. It's not as simple. Well, okay, come on, just leave. You can't just do that, okay? Why don't you reach out for help? They don't trust law enforcement. Part of that grooming process is to create a mistrust with law enforcement at the very beginning. To the point on some of the international cases, they will actually have part of their own organization wear uniforms, where they believe that law enforcement is part of the corruption. And that's a very powerful, powerful psychological tool. And then you're told that you're going to go out in the street and cross over and you see law enforcement and ask them to help you, and what will happen to you or your family members if you do that? Of course they're afraid. They're isolated. They've been given false promises. And that's why I say to you, if you ever help somebody, please don't make promises that you can't keep. Don't tell them everything's going to be okay. I'm going to help you. I'm going to take you away. I'm going to bring you home. I will get you to law enforcement. Please don't make promises that you can't keep, and don't endanger yourself or further endanger that victim. Because they have been raised through the grooming process on misinformation and false promises. And as I said, they do blame society. It's our fault. We let them down. They are hopeless. They have resigned to that hopelessness. They also, once again, do not know where they are. There's a lack of social systems. They have no idea how to use them. So let's look at some of the control mechanisms that are actually used by the traffickers. They do that relationship control, which we've talked about. Drugs, deception, isolation, violence and threats of violence, the collusion, right? We're all going to work together, law enforcement's with us, debt bondage, imprisonment. Now, religion, culture, and belief, this is very delicate and very important. A lot of victims have a strong religious or cultural tie. And what will happen is the trafficker or the groomer will bring in somebody from their own culture or religious tie who will then embarrass them and explain to them how they should not go home. They should not tell anybody because they have turned against their own religious beliefs, and they are an embarrassment to society. Oftentimes they will bring in somebody who's maybe, if it's a priest, who may come in dressed as a priest who's really not a priest, so that they can reinforce the terror. So the traffickers really do have a strong code that they live by, and their sole purpose is what? Money. Profit, profit, profit. So let's look at some of the trauma bonds. The trauma bond we spoke about, that's the strong emotional attachment between the abused person and their abuser. So that is what? That's our pimp, right? The boyfriend, girlfriend part of the grooming process. What's the Stockholm Syndrome? That's right. That's where the victim is so in love with the pimp, right, or the trafficker, where they can't leave. And remember I told you about the Lima Syndrome? That's the converse. That's where the abductor actually feels sympathy for the hostages and actually falls in love with their own victim. Okay? So let's look at relationship control. Relationship control blends all of these controls. It takes the violence, the deception, and the collusion, and it makes people take oaths of allegiance. So you are going to prove your love to me. You are going to do something for me that you would not normally do for anyone else, so that you will prove to me that you love me. You're a pimp. You're a trafficker. That will take you out of sex trafficking and possibly into drug transport. You must commit that next crime, because I need to be sure that I truly have you in bondage. And those oaths and promises are very common. And that reinstills the fear. That reinstills the coercion part, right? That keeps you in there. Then we go through victim's response. And this is actually where the tension turns into the explosion, and the pimp gets crazy, and the victim tries to calm the pimp. So they try to stop what? Against themselves, right? Against themselves. Very important. They know it's coming, but now what have they become? They become the nurturer. Okay? And that reinforces the love relationship. Okay? So this is all part of the process. So, we talked about this before. If you do ever encounter something, please remember to work with law enforcement or the proper authorities. Do not return victims that have not been assessed, okay? Because there are others who have been involved with this victim in the sex trafficking process, and you can pose a risk to the victims. Victims need to receive appropriate assistance, and they need to have that assistance that breaks down the relationship control, and professionals need to do that. Professionals need to work with that, and law enforcement needs to make the assessment of whether or not a victim should be placed back in their own home, because law enforcement is the most astute to be able to decide if the trafficking actually occurred by the person in the home, or the boyfriend, or the girlfriend, or wherever, or whether it be a foster care. Law enforcement makes that decision, not us, okay? And I'm sorry to keep saying that, but it's so important, okay? We need to rely on our authorities to do their job. We need to assist them in doing their job. And as you saw, victims have been taught that law enforcement are the enemies. And so we do not want to jump in and say, oh, right, okay, and make it look like they are the enemies, because they're not. They are the ones that can actually help these victims get to safety.
That's what Michael Jackson did when he was
That's
grabbing
correct.
all them boys.
That's exactly right. You're exactly right. Traffickers actually blend these control methods, and part of it is don't tell anybody. Sure, that's the secret. It's our secret. Don't tell anybody. And then they will change their emphasis and their approach, where you are not grateful. I don't like ungratefuls. And what does that tell you? What's coming? The beatings, right? Here we go again. We're reinforcing the grooming process. And pimps and traffickers will go back over and over and over again to reinforce that grooming process. Because if it breaks down, we go back stronger. And you're not going to be worth anything to me if I have to keep moving you out of one stable to another. I need you to make money. I need you to move up the ladder, not sold for somebody else that I have to go through this process with again. So the more concessions that we give you, the better chance it will be that you will not escape. So if I give you small amounts of freedom, a little bit of money, a telephone privilege, you're going to take that as, this is good. He trusts me, right? Or she trusts me. This also comes with a powerful threat. I'll take it away, and you know what will happen to you if you breach this concession. Okay? Oftentimes when a victim is picked up and they're going through an interviewing process, it's good to give them back some control. So when you're working with law enforcement, if you happen to be involved in a matter, if a victim needs to go to the restroom, it's nice to give them a card where they can just flip it over and say, I need to use the restroom, so they're in control of their own dignity, because they've had that taken away from them so often. Instead of saying to them, do you need to use the restroom, or why don't we go to the restroom right now? Giving back the control to them, the dignity building is very important. And that also, I know these are things you don't really think of, but these little elements are part of that breakdown of that grooming process. And the grooming process is very thorough and very degrading. Drugs are also a form of control, okay, because they are used by the traffickers to sex trafficking victims to numb them physically, okay, get them out of the emotional pain of being a victim, okay. Then they become addicted to the drugs, okay, and guess what? Now they're going to work for the trafficker to get the drugs. I would rather have the drugs. I don't even need to go across the street to place a phone call. Okay? They will also force their victims to sell those drugs. Why would they do that?
Another crime.
Collusion, right? That's part of the collusion control. That's exactly right. It's forcing another crime to happen. Deception control. Now, many of these cases actually begin with deception, and the deception doesn't have to be complete deception, it can be partial deception. And it usually happens in those early stages of the process, and it happens during that grooming process. The victim finally is told, if they don't realize, that they've actually been trafficked. And oftentimes, a victim may not realize they've been trafficked. So when it becomes a cost-benefit situation to the trafficker, it's time for me to tell you, okay? The fun part's over. I'm not going to expend any more money on you. You've been trafficked. Now you're going to go out and earn the money. So the different control methods that are used are violence and isolation. So you can either go further into the violence and the beatings, or I can just isolate you and leave you there. And time in that world by yourself, that is a horrific type of control mechanism. Yep. So how do you deal with it? You need to be aware of the signs, and we're not trained to be aware of the signs, right? Any physical evidence that needs to be recovered, who should recover it? Police. Thank you. Right, okay. They need to be recovered lawfully. Photographs and other techniques will be used, okay? Don't take the victim's telephone. Let the authorities take the victim's telephone, okay? The victim may have an attorney or whatever, okay? But there are questions that are designed to see if deception was actually used, okay? These victims feel embarrassed. They feel like they've been treated with deceit. Don't judge them. Don't ask them, how could you have actually believed that? Okay? We do that to our kids. We don't do that. Okay? You don't want to do that. You don't want to say, how could you have actually believed that? How dumb could you have been? Weren't you suspicious? That's not what we're here to do. We're not here to inquire, because if it was us, we could have been in the same situation. How many times have you just said yes? And that you think back now and you say, I wonder, especially if you were younger, if at that point in time, if it had gone a little further, if I couldn't have become a victim of human
As
trafficking.
I'm sitting here listening to you, I realized in the 70s when I was a lot younger that I had been trafficked. But apparently the Lord was watching out for me because I was able to get away.
Thank goodness. Well, I want to talk to you, definitely, if you're open to that. I would love to talk to you, because that happens a lot. I was in the Bahamas, and I did a training in the Bahamas, and a woman who was a psychologist over there, and she actually stood up at the end of one of the trainings, and she said that she was trafficked, and she had to come out and explain it, and she really was trafficked. And she had come over from Jamaica to the Bahamas. And it just happens. You don't realize it. And see what happens here. So they use methods to increase the sense of isolation control. They restrict communications. They take away your phones. You get your phone when you go to work. Take your phone away. Your phone is tracked. Okay? There's always a constant presence of traffickers or their associates around you. So you may be working on corner A, and then you see right across the street, somebody's in a car watching. You may be allowed to go across the street to get a hamburger. Somebody's actually sitting in the diner. The actual diner people may actually be working with the traffickers. You're denied access to religious services. That is a very powerful, powerful play. I can't begin to stress that enough, because many people are rooted in their culture and in their faith. And when you take that away from somebody, they lose hope. And if they lose hope, they're willing to do anything for the fear that they'll never get out. And then they start to lose hope to survive. And in a situation when you are trafficked, usually, thank goodness, you're not even in a situation where you have the choice to take your own life, because you're isolated with no tools to do so. So this is a very powerful tool of reinforcement to take away somebody's religious belief and their services. So your opportunity can be completely eliminated to socialize, including your new stable, right? You don't get to socialize with the other victims. So now they've taken away your entire family, your entire communication. You have no idea who's alive or who's not alive anymore. You do not know where you're going to end up. This was the worst thing that can happen to you? No. something else worse is being planned, and that's what goes on in their mind. Their meals may be served in solitude, and as far as they're concerned, they're not going to have any type of refrain or be able to speak to anybody again. And being isolated is then built up with more and more and more sexually exploited activities. So maybe you started out with 1, then you hit 10. It could go for 48 hours, for 3 days, nonstop, okay? Just nonstop. So how do you deal with it? They're separated from sleeping and eating quarters, and their accommodations are concealed. Those are your signs. How does a victim deal with that? A strong-willed person can barely deal with that, right? So you're being trained over and over and over again. And you would be aware as a victim of these situations that happen and what it does to your mind, you know. And we are so compassionate and we just want to reach out and help. But you can't help if you don't know where they are. You can't help if you do know where they are, because you need to get the proper authorities to do it. Yes?
They lose all self-esteem. They take everything away.
That's exactly right. Your self-esteem's gone, your dignity's gone. You become what? Soulless, hollow. Yes.
I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and I see children in Massachusetts. And I have a patient who was sent to me when she was 8 years old. She had been born into a situation where her mother and father were sex traffickers. She never left the room since birth. She was put in that room with her sister. She was only allowed to go from the room to the bathroom. No one spoke with her. When someone finally reported it and called the police, they went in, and her sister had developed a totally different language that nobody could understand. She's now 8 years old. She's been adopted by a wonderful couple, but she is still, she goes to school and not realizing she's a broken child in many ways. They condemn her behavior,
We talked
and
about that.
they don't look at her IEP or her history and understand what this child's been through, and it makes me furious.
Thank you for what you do. I just need to get a glass of water.
Do you want to take a little break?
It's up to you.
Yeah.
So just to recap, right? Violence and the threats of violence, they're used at any stage, okay? But when are they not used? The origin of the grooming process, because you're not going to be violent there, right? You're going to be loving there. That's correct. Now, if you're just taken, if it's a different situation where it's a group who are picked up and taken, the violence starts right away. But if it's the grooming process and that type of allure into the trafficking world, you will not use the violence right there. You were, I know, no. But you didn't understand it at the time, and that's what we talked about before, that sometimes people have to be told they were sold and told that they are victims of trafficking. So the violence and the threats of violence can be used at any stage. They will use the fact that they will target your victims and your families and your friends, and then direct violence actually goes at various stages, but usually at the early stage so you remember it and then you believe it, okay? So if the victim has been obtained through deception, the violence and threats, or if you try to escape, will reinforce this in order to achieve the compliance. Victims may not be directly threatened, okay, but they will always live in the fear of that violence, okay? If I could just suggest to a victim of human trafficking, and I am the trafficker or the pimp, that I know where a family member of yours lives, that's enough, okay? That is enough to get you to comply, to continue to get you to conform. The message itself does not have to be stated, it can be implied. The key is you conform to my rules, you conform to my ways, I make money, we get along. I don't make money, I don't need you anymore. And remember the byproducts of human trafficking that we spoke about. So, the message itself, again, it could be obvious, it could be subtle, it could be concealed, but you must not assume that a person was not violated because you don't see visible injuries once a victim has been retrieved, okay? You don't know when the violence happened. You don't know if it's all psychological. You don't know the victim itself, herself or himself. You don't know how susceptible they are to the psychological compliance factors that are put in. So somebody may have very low self-esteem, and that person just, may not be beaten because that person already becomes compliant sooner than later. So indicators of possible violence or threats, you should note them if you see them and report them. Don't act, because we are not the authorities to act. So what we have, symptoms of traumatization, you hear the accounts of stories of violence. If somebody is telling you those stories, take as good notes as you possibly can. Once we get you to the point where you're qualified to do that, okay, take as much down as you possibly can so that you could report it to the proper authorities, okay? If they tell you that somebody has done this and there were witnesses, get the names, get all the information you possibly can. But the authorities will look for injuries, nurses will look for injuries, the hospitals, the proper medical authorities. They will photograph when necessary with permission. They will do everything that they can possibly do. If you see something without, somebody having to remove their clothes, if you see a branding or a tattoo, make note. That information to law enforcement is very, very helpful, okay? But a doctor, a nurse, law enforcement, those are the people who should be doing this, not the bystander. Part of the collusion control is telling the victim, don't tell anyone. If you tell somebody, repercussion to your family, repercussion to you, repercussion to a stable member, okay? Removal, death. So that's part of the actual collusion. A victim is easier to control once they have been, through the collusion process. Once they engage in conduct that goes against any of the family values or the religious beliefs, a victim will become powerless and they will feel guilty. And I can't reinforce the fact of taking away somebody's faith. Because to victims, when they realize that they are trafficked, even if they are not religious or spiritual, they become more so inclined to be religious or spiritual. And they reach for that help. That's their hope. And if you take that away, they don't have anything anymore. So the key for collusion is to get them to be promoted to the higher ups within the ranks of the traffickers. So they want to get to be the bottom girl. The bottom girl is the one who does what? The threats, make sure you meet your quota. You are the girl who the pimp really likes, okay? That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So the recruiter, the escort, the enforcer, all of these people participate in that collusion. And it's very complex to defend in a court of law. It's how do you prove collusion? So we need the witnesses. We need the person's age. We need very descriptive pictures of the homes where they were kept. We need tattoos. We need who did it, where they were. all of those signs. Evidence is very important. And once you get a victim who can really give you that information, then you can build a strong case. And that's the key. But that's what happens. The person has to be at the heart of the sex trafficking, and they become the sex trafficking victim. And it's all done through collusion. If a victim accepts money from the trafficker, they psychologically feel that they're getting a benefit from being exploited. I mean, if you have to live with being exploited, I might as well get some money so I could go out and, buy something for myself and rebuild my own dignity. And you know what? $1 gives me dignity. To that victim, whatever they can grasp is what they're going to use. So remember we said, don't blame them for what they have done as a result. They have been psychologically broken, okay? And so we need to deal with that and not the blame. A victim may feel that they should be ashamed because maybe they did consent once, or maybe they didn't consent at all, or they had sex without a condom. Should they be ashamed? Was it their fault? What's going to be the result of that? They have participated in a very specific sexual act that could be such a horrific thing for them, okay? So that is the shame, that is the guilt. What are they doing? They're reinforcing the compliance, okay? So if the victim actually believes that they have committed a crime that is vulnerable to blackmail or extortion, they will be more in debt to the trafficker and more likely not to tell the truth or give the facts to law enforcement or the prosecutors, okay? Hopefully we can get a victim to an attorney where they understand privilege, and then it's okay. And I'll tell you how you explain sometimes privilege to a child trafficking victim, because attorney-client privilege is very difficult to explain to an adult, let alone to a child. And don't let me forget to tell you that. Okay, so now we have the debt bondage control. This is where you actually owe money now and you have to pay off your debt. I gave you food, you owe me. I gave you a place to live, you owe me. Even if the place was in a basement, okay, and I gave you a bedpan, okay, it doesn't matter. You owe me. So those are the fees that are actually charged to the victims, and here they are. I can charge you for my transportation, I can charge you for accommodation, food, any other expense that happens to be part of the trafficker. I might have had a drink that day, I might have had to get you a prettier scarf to wear, I might have gotten you a wig, okay? Anything that I could write off on my business expenses, okay, as a trafficker, you're going to pay for. Even if they're fictitious, even if they're greatly exaggerated, okay? Then there's an interest, or a VIN, that is charged on the debt. Because why should I lend you money without interest? So every time you get closer to paying off your debt, the interest gets higher because it took you longer. But that's what banks do, right? So we want to watch these traffickers because what are the traffickers in it for? Money. And it's a business, okay? So there may be unpaid room rent in a brothel. That's very high interest because that's a room. That's a room and you're with other people in a brothel. That's socialization. That's a high level rent, okay? If you can pay off the debt bond, you're removed and you're promoted within the ranks. So I can't let you go, right? So I let you pay off your debt. And now what have I just done? I started to groom you again. Trust me, I love you, the relationship, I'm proud of you, you can move up the ladder. So how do you deal with it? You ask the victim, not you, right? When I say you, I mean the authorities, right? They'll ask who the debt was paid to, how much they paid, what were the interest rates, what do you currently owe, okay? what was supplied, what were the goods you got, what were the services that were supplied. They're trying to find out at what point the victim was actually told there was a debt, and if there were conditions of debt, and if those conditions of debt varied from victim to victim, or if they changed with one specific victim and kept changing the interest, like as you moved up, and then they can see how a victim is moved up. Because what law enforcement needs to do is figure out how the actual stable works and how the trafficking pyramid actually works. Now we have imprisonment control. These are brothels where victims are held in locked buildings, okay? A person seems to have liberty. If you're in a locked building, what kind of liberty could you have? So it's illusionary, and you have a guard, but what kind of liberty could you have? You're free for maybe a day or two, not being beaten, right? You're safe because you're in a secure place.
Yeah, but you're still scared.
Of course, but it's illusionary. So you redefine, you justify, you rationalize. And that's part of what? The higher level grooming process to get them to move up the ranks. So usually there will be fences or guards when you go into this type of isolation. There'll be locks on the outsides of the doors. And you will find that sometimes people will actually live at the places where they work. That is very common, okay? So you may see at some construction places, at some massage parlors, or some nail salons, au pairs, they actually live where the trafficking is taking place. If you know of this, or you see of something like this, or you suspect something, tell law enforcement. Tell the agency, call the health and fire departments if you see something going on like that, and let them go and investigate it. Let them go and check it out. Because these are indicators that sex trafficking is taking place. Once again, okay, the religion, culture, and belief controls, the prevention of religious services, this is a serious psychological effect on a victim, especially if religion is a strong part of their belief. And that is part of the reinforcement of control. And traffickers do use this for control. So during a questioning process, if you're sitting with law enforcement or you're sitting with whoever and you have been part of this, the questioning process should be open-minded, okay? Don't go in there with any kind of prejudice. Don't go in there with any kind of mindset. Be very open-minded. Sit back. Don't judge. Because it doesn't matter if you believe them. It matters that they are becoming alive again, that they are coming out, okay? Because if prevention from worship has actually occurred, you have to handle it very carefully when you do bring someone in from their own type of worship, because they don't trust that person anymore. And they're shamed, and we went through all that, how they're shamed, they feel they've been isolated from their families and their culture, their community. So you have to use caution when doing that, but it's important that they are brought back in, but you have to use caution on how to do it. And we're gonna pass through the power and control because we already did this. Let's try this case study and see what you think. John grew up in a situation of violence. His mother was an alcoholic and pushed him out of a window from the first floor when he was 10. A female friend of his mother gave him some money and took him to her house. John was immediately turned over to a sex trafficker. John was 13 years old. He was locked in an apartment wearing only his underwear, and he was threatened with the fact that his little brother would be killed if he didn't cooperate. John's mother found out and did nothing to help him. So, what were the control mechanisms used in that case?
Well, his mother being violent toward him in the first place. So the trafficker somehow found that out, and that the kid was vulnerable.
Okay, so the key is, and you just said exactly what's important, The trafficker found out somehow what his mother did, because what the mother did wasn't the control mechanism, but the trafficker used what the mother did to get the woman to bring him to the home. That's correct. How is the blend of control methods used throughout that entire trafficking process? What else happened there to John?
Isolation. His little brother.
Isolation?
Threatening his little brother.
Threatening his little brother?
Deprivation of clothes.
That's right, deprivation of clothes. They gave him money, right? They gave him some money. So, for what reasons do you think the sex traffickers may change the type of control method used?
Confuse you.
In this case, they use so many. Why didn't they just use one?
Then you use one to get him there and another to keep him there.
That's right. And another one to keep him fearful of leaving. Each one had a tie to what the trafficker intended to do. Okay, let's look at Sally. Sally was, and these are all cases that happened, by the way. So, Sally was lured from Idaho to Manhattan after answering an advertisement for a casting call for a model. She was imprisoned and gang raped. She was 17 years old. When her sex traffickers believed her to be sufficiently broken down, they pressured her to prostitute herself. She found out that they were preparing false documents and were going to take her to another location. In her desperation to run away, she jumped from the third floor of the building where she was locked up. The police took her to the hospital, and she was diagnosed as suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. She had a good education and had previously held many interests. There was no violence or abuse in her family. She decided to fight to help stop the traffickers from taking other women. She filed a complaint with the police. This happened over 10 years ago. To date, none of the accused have been sentenced. She dedicated her life to the lawsuit and spent her money on paying lawyers' fees and legal expenses. She suffers from perpetual anxiety. What worries her most is that her memory has begun to erase the traumatic event. She remembers almost none of the concrete details of the horrors she lived through, and she still needs to be a witness in the court. What could have been done early on to obtain and maintain an accurate account now that Sally is having these memory issues?
Shouldn't the lawyers have gotten her to give a full testimony right away?
Possibly, but remember, she's got post-traumatic stress disorder. She was diagnosed with that the minute she was brought to the hospital, and asking these questions, right?
Establish trust.
Okay, without making promises you can't keep, right? So yeah, you try to establish trust, bringing in professionals who are trained on how to ask these questions. Okay, we're going to get into confidentiality and legal privilege in a minute, and to see if even that would have helped do this. Perhaps give Sally her own tape recorder.
And sometimes it's not always easy to remember what's going on.
That's right, she may not know. So Sally could have just dumped anything she wanted to talk about, and possibly in there a professional could have deciphered and pulled out and then asked appropriate questions. So what type of questions would you ask Sally now?
I have ways of screening. I'm a mandated reporter.
Right.
So I am on high alert. In particular, I see many, many foster children. I see many children coming from economically depressed families. I see children from really high, and I see no difference, by the way, in the numbers of parents who abuse their children. And what I do is I ask the parent in every child I see to please leave the room. And if they object or there's a problem, I have a problem.
Good.
And I also watch the child. When I ask the child the question, if she looks at her parent or caregiver before she'll answer me. And these are little, I mean, I'll leap up and file, but
Sure.
it puts a red flag to watch out for that.
And that's vital. That's very important. But now let's roll it just for 1 second. We know where Sally is right now. 10 years, nothing has happened. Do we want to ask her questions about her case, or do we want to figure out how to get Sally whatever help she needs to move forward? Right? Let's focus. That's the questions I would want to deal with Sally with. It's like, how do we get Sally where she needs to go? Because it's 10 years, nothing has happened. We need to focus on Sally and get Sally to go forward. So, what problems did you see encountered by the case with law enforcement in that case?
We weren't able to get enough
The
evidence.
information, right? They couldn't get the information. Prosecutors didn't have the same thing, right? Didn't have enough evidence. She was not going to be a witness that was going to be able to withstand the trial. Investigators, she didn't remember anything, right? Social workers, they could help Sally. She had post-traumatic stress disorder, triggers, red flags. Remember the situation, the case I told you about the woman who came home every time the child said, Daddy's home, it triggered something. Some cases, you just can't get to the trafficker, no matter how horrific they are. And that's why it's, such a horrible process. So the effects of the grooming and the importance of counseling, coaching, and legal representation, because there usually is PTSD, okay? Because there's usually depression, because there's usually a disconnection from any of the feelings that somebody has had, okay? And there is an effect, okay, at the end of the day when you are trafficked. Okay, there are anxiety disorders, self-blame, hopelessness, helplessness, nightmares and recurring dreams of what happened. How do you distinguish if somebody's going to inquire between what was a nightmare, what was a dream, and what actually happened? And that's why some of these cases just don't make it. Anger and anger management issues, and you should be angry, okay? And you're forced to engage in other crimes while you were trafficked. So all of these are part of the trafficking, grooming process. This is a big business. This is very organized, sure.
Are people prosecutable for crimes that they were coerced into doing while trafficked?
It depends on the paradigm, the point in time. Okay, usually you're not, but each case is different. I mean, are you going to be charged with a crime if it resulted in the harm or murder to another victim? Probably. Because can you get away with the defense of, well, I don't know right from wrong? Well, maybe did you at what point in time didn't you know right from wrong? So every case is different, okay? I mean, I would think if it was just stealing a soda, no. But, or, something like that, or taking a drug to have the sexual act, most likely a judge is going to say, okay, wait. But it depends on the crime. Okay? So, oh, I'm so sorry.
I was just thinking that I don't think that, one of the risk factors was being incarcerated or adjudicated, but many, many women are in prison who we arguably could say have been trafficked and are in prison because of things they did with their trafficker or for their trafficker or because of their trafficker. So I think it has everything to do with law enforcement and how they look at a crime and whether they ask the right questions.
The evidence and the questions. And to that point, actually, I think it was 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, I trained the legislation on trafficking in women in prisons. And not only that, there's actually trafficking going on inside the prisons, and people are looking at the sites to see when they come out, how to groom them, how to send money in for their accounts and move it forward. But you're absolutely right, it's the questions, and that's what we're trying to say is we have to go to law enforcement. They do need attorneys. If they have attorneys, they have a better chance of, you know, not going in for a crime that's associated with it. But there are deals that are made, and sometimes they're put into the prisons when it's trafficking for their protection.
There was an article in the New York Times, I think it was New York Times Magazine, either last weekend or the one before, which profiled a woman who had, I think, just gotten out of jail, and it's an exact vignette of this.
Really?
You know, it describes how she was groomed, it describes how she then, like in her case, it wasn't drugs, it was, he handed her a gun, hide this, and then there was a violent crime and he died in it, and she ended up going to jail.
She died because he died in it. And that's what I was saying. It depends on the situation of the crime. Thank you for that, because that's important. You just put, yeah, but you just put that into context, so that's important. Okay. So there's also suicidal ideations, paranoia. Remember the trauma bonding, the Stockholm, we talked about that. And always remember there's that Lima syndrome too that we talked about. Spiritual disruption, rage, dual diagnosis, self-care, sleeping issues, and disassociation. So all of these are issues that I don't ever want you to forget. Let's look at Kim. This is an interesting one. Kim is a 15-year-old girl discovered by a first responder only after she had been in the detention center for a week. She was arrested when police observed her answering a phone call from an undercover detective arranging a prostitute through an ad on Backpage on the web. When Kim tried to run, she was beaten by the other girl so badly she could not walk for a few days and had to stay in a hotel. Kim is 15. She is not past the 8th grade, and she, with her mother in Kentucky, who has 7 other children and a new boyfriend, is where she lived. Her mother will not answer phone calls and has not communicated with Kim in months. Before she left Kentucky, Kim was living with her girlfriends. If this case goes to trial, who's the first responder? You want me to roll it back? See, I said, do you want me to, but it's really Savannah who's rolling it back. She was discovered by a first responder only after she had been in the detention center for a week. She was arrested when a police observed her answering a phone call. Okay. Who's the first responder here?
Somebody was working in the detention
Inside the detention center. That's right. What problems do you identify in bringing this case to trial?
Who's the trafficker?
Was there a trafficker at this point? This was a setup. This was the police who were actually trying to elicit a trafficker, who they were trying to do the case, so they went undercover and they actually placed the call. Okay, so a good defense attorney is going to go in there and say, hey, you know, this is an investigation and what is going on. What control methods will need to be identified for the judge, jury, if it even gets that far?
Maybe an understanding of what the process, what happens, this whole thing that you've been doing with us today, maybe it's in some way of encapsulating how sex trafficking, how they're groomed.
It's hard, right? But what I want to know is, what are the control methods? What control methods that the trafficker would use that would need to be identified? Because everybody's going to say, oh yeah, this is trafficking, but you have to prove it. So what would be those control methods? Did you see any? Did you see any control methods?
Not in contact with the family.
Sure, back. Sure.
She's not in school.
That the detention person was in control, so she had to
But remember that the control method comes from the traffic.
Well, the other girls were beating her, so they were probably not just girlfriends. So there was a control happening there with the other girls.
Hard to prove, huh? Real hard to prove. Okay. So, was Kim groomed?
I would say yes.
How was she groomed?
Threat of violence is the only thing, but they didn't even say there was a threat of violence.
Remember the grooming by the trafficker?
You mean how would it actually be proved? I mean, I'm just like.
Yeah. What I'm saying is, in the elements of the case that you got here, did you see what we discussed? Did we see the relationship part?
Isolation. She was living with her
Now,
friends.
okay, but let's go. She was living with her friends. Right?
So she was either, she could have been homeless at one point or she had insecure housing, so she had that need.
She had the need, but did the trafficker groom her in this particular case?
I don't think there's much evidence.
Not much evidence for it. We had the elements of why she'd be a victim,
Right.
why she'd be a target, but the elements to prove so far are not here. Was she trafficked?
There's no real proof of it.
More likely than not, it will get there. And the case actually did get there. She was beaten, they proved it, she spoke. Yeah. But the bottom line is, if you just had this much information, you can't come right out and say she was trafficked and here's why. It needs a thorough investigation. And that's why I'm saying it's very important that we don't jump to conclusions and that we really have like attorneys and law enforcement do the thorough.
Is this a federal law that against trafficking?
Yeah, it was, remember I told you the federal.
I know the FBI gets involved in kidnapping. Are they heavily involved in this? Okay.
Yeah, and that's what I gave you the law at the beginning. I told you the federal trafficking law of 2000. And I have a handout that'll give you all that information as well. So here in Vermont, here's the areas that you should pay attention for the vulnerabilities. We have the I-89 corridor, internet, social media, lack of training for professionals, okay, very important. We have the perception in Vermont of a very liberal court system. Most people, compared to other states, okay, we want to release our prisoners, send them back to their families and put them back into society. So we're not looking to put traffickers in jail, the mindset. It's like trafficking, not in Vermont. But now we know better, okay? Ignorance, we don't want to talk about it. We believe that youth can actually consent or make a choice. That's not true. We learned that today, right? Okay. We believe that trafficking only occurs in large cities and in refugee populations. We know that that's not true, right? Heroin epidemic, that's in Vermont, so that makes trafficking more vulnerable. Overwhelmed human services system. We have an overwhelmed human services system, okay? And we have lack of drug treatment facilities, okay, in beds. So we have lack of beds in the prisons. And so that is a major issue. So these are some of the vulnerabilities of Vermont and some of the reasons why trafficking is here. So now let's just talk for a second about who a first responder is. Anyone who first has contact with a victim. Child welfare caseworkers, doctors, nurses, hospital personnel, law enforcement officials, teachers, school resource officers, religious officials, and possibly you. If you come into contact with a victim, you are a first responder, okay? So what I want you to look at is, when is a first responder a mandatory reporter, okay? So professionals who actually, because of their work with these vulnerable populations, they're required to report abuse. And that abuse can be financial abuse, physical abuse, sexual or other neglect, or any type of risk of serious harm to somebody. Yeah, exactly. That's correct. And you must report this even if you suspect it, okay? If you don't report it, it can lead to civil and criminal charges against the first responder themselves for, not reporting this. And you may be forced to actually testify against the victim themselves by a subpoena. And that's why I said to you, please, do not make promises you can't keep to any victim you may come into contact with, because you may be the one who's testifying against that victim themselves.
I had a situation, it's been a long time ago now, but I was teaching in a workshop and there was a lot of private, confidential information, and a young woman was talking about her father and her uncle that's how they made their money, was human trafficking. And we were all, what do we do? I mean, in that situation, there was a confidentiality of this so I wasn't talking to the person who had been trafficked, it's her family.
It was hearsay, or because you heard
No,
it?
she
or
was, she was actually saying,
to you.
to a room full of people, like
And
60
what was
people.
the situation? What was the setup of that?
The setup was,
Was it like an AA meeting? Or
it wasn't an
something?
AA
Okay, so
meeting,
was
but
that-
it's the context of an exercise, which is, there's confidentiality that's agreed to.
Confidentiality is different, and we're going to talk about that.
Okay, great. Because
So,
we
we're
were
gonna
all
talk
like,
about that.
what do
So
we
if
do?
if somebody came right out and said, there's trafficking, blah, 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 yeah, it should be reported, mandatory reports. However, we're going to talk about legal privilege versus confidentiality, two different things, and I'm assuming that her lawyer was not there because her lawyer would have made her not. Okay. Okay, just checking. Okay. So there's always that potential for re-traumatization, and the first responder plays an incredibly important role in how you work with a victim, because the first responder can participate innocently in that re-traumatization. Like, remember I told you about judges asking specific questions, unaware, we went through those examples, that they could just re-traumatize the victim. So you want to be careful. But remember, the greatest intentions of a first responder can be detrimental for that victim. So breathe, just think of how to contact somebody to get them to safety, watch out for safety for yourself, and get to the right authorities. But you must, as first responders, understand the consequences that can actually come from your own attempts to assist victims that do not have legal representation. And as far as I'm concerned, all victims should have legal representation. I believe that so strongly, okay, that they should have legal representation. But it's not always the case, and by the time you get them an attorney, other situations could have built up. So, where concern is for stopping potential re-traumatization of the victim by the first responder as well. So what are we doing here in Vermont? We have a human trafficking task force. We have trafficking of minors work groups. We have trainings. We have multidisciplinary liaisons. We have human trafficking PSAs. We have development of a policy between DCF and the federals with federal agencies with guidance. And we're trying to do as much awareness as we possibly can. But here's what we need to pay attention to: the victim's needs. They need to be safe. They need basic housing. They need basic food, basic clothing. They need to have trauma-informed responses and strength-based approach that helps them. We have to watch out for gender-responsive care, culturally responsive care, which we talked about in depth. And we need to have thoughtful timing before a law enforcement investigation actually happens. But we cannot impede a law enforcement investigation. They make that decision. They are the ones who determine the timing of an investigation. And of course, I believe we need to get them attorneys. They have tangible needs: safety, shelter, food, education, medical, dental. We have to help them navigate the legal system if they don't have an attorney. They have a crisis hotline. Somebody needs to be the support person. Sometimes they need transportation, case management, therapeutic groups, counseling. All of this is what Vermont is putting together now. And we're trying to get this to the victims of human trafficking. So there is a big lift for tangible needs. There's also a lift for intangible needs. And once again, we have to address those psychological issues. And we have to look at, don't be judgmental. Remember, we went through the shift in how we should approach it. We have to be healthy and have good peer relationships for them. We have to help them find good relationships so that they can trust, go to counselors who are trained on how to do this. We need to help them redefine their own love, their sex, and their identity. And we have to get them back into their own cultural provider services because, as again, that's what they lose the most. So in an organization that I had co-founded years ago that's worked with so many of these victims, we put together a matrix that was designed that we help the legal system and judges to go through that has a criteria of different types of questions that could be asked to come up with indicators in the different paradigm that we, elements that we spoke about, so that they could help meet their case. And we would walk through these questions, and then they would have a value. And if they had X amount of points in each category, it meant that the case would probably make it through a trial. And we helped the judge with that. So that was used for court hearings and law enforcement. And we've helped over 3,000 victims, if not more at this point in time, using this. And we take those indicators, and then we would show whether or not it was medium indicators, strong indicators in a different area. This would also help a judge determine where to send a youth victim of human trafficking. Maybe they need to go out of state. Maybe they need to stay in state. Maybe they can go back to their parents. So this matrix has been used, and it's been very valuable and helpful, and it has helped many victims of human trafficking, and has helped attorneys to help those victims of human trafficking. So we have select federal laws, which is where you'll get sheer that. We have the Mann Act, which talks about transporting victims across the state lines. And we have RICO, racketeering, which is probably easier way to get trafficking victims than the trafficking stables, the traffickers themselves, than charging them with human trafficking, which is just like, it's easier to get organized crime on tax evasion than it is on organized crime. Okay, and we have our state statute in Vermont, and all of these explain what we do and what we are doing in Vermont to build it more. So there's been a lift to try to get us aware, and I'm hoping that we raise it much higher, raise the bar higher. And so that's